So let me jump in. I am very excited to be here, and I have been studying this topic actually for quite a long time before my district decided to make their change, which was just exciting to me. The first I heard about this was over 20 years ago when Kyla Wallstrom published the first research on changing school start times close to you all in Edina, Minnesota. And she just sort of led the movement there and been following it and doing studies in other areas. And like I said, my district that I matriculated from and that my son is now in made this change back in 2017. So the perspective I'm providing tonight, I call it a socio-ecological perspective, because when we think about changing school start times, what we typically focus on is adolescent sleep and adolescent health. But when you change school start times, you change an entire system, because kids don't live in a vacuum, and those adolescents live with families and in communities, and there's teachers in your schools and staff. And so this is a start time change that we wanted to approach looking at from all aspects and all key stakeholders. But starting off with the basic science about why it's important to have healthy school start times, adolescents have a biological need of 8.5 to 9.25 hours of sleep per night. That's not a recommendation. It's a physiological need that's been demonstrated in some very nice experimental studies where you take adolescents, you put them in a dark sleep environment for 3 weeks, and you let them catch up on their sleep, and you let them sleep whenever they want, and they're not influenced by school or by light or by technology or anything, and they all end up sleeping 8.5 to 9.25 hours of sleep. The problem is that in the United States, currently 3 out of 4 adolescents are getting less than 7 hours of sleep per night, which is considered significant sleep deprivation. It's a national public health issue. Adults aren't much better, but again, we're here to talk about students today. And when 3 out of 4 teens aren't getting enough sleep, it's highly problematic. So when teens and kids don't get enough sleep, it has very significant impact on all aspects of their health and well-being. The first thing any parent or teacher or staff member will tell you is mood and affect changes, right? You see kids, they get sullen, they get moody, they get incorrigible. Younger children get very hyperactive. You can quickly see those changes, and we do know that long-term sleep deprivation can have a very significant impact on the development of mental health issues in kids. We see behavior problems. As I mentioned, young kids become very hyperactive. There have been some experimental studies where you take healthy, typically developing kids and you sleep deprive them just by a little bit, like an hour for 3 to 5 nights, and you can see that they start behaving as if they have ADHD. And then you take a child who actually has ADHD and you sleep deprive them a little bit, and their behavior becomes uncontrollable. So when kids don't get enough sleep, it affects not only their mood, how they behave. It creates neurocognitive deficits. So again, very small amounts of sleep loss, an hour for 3 to 4 nights, can put a child at a full grade level behind their peers in terms of things like fine motor skills that they might need for writing, short-term reaction time, memory, things that they very much need to have in a classroom. We see increased risk-taking behaviors in accidents, in particular with adolescents. Adolescents aren't necessarily the best to begin with in terms of making good judgment and decision, but when they're sleep deprived, they're even less so. And so a lot of risk-taking, accidental behaviors, things including drowsy driving, but even just on a day-to-day basis, making poor decisions. And finally, there's a direct link between insufficient sleep and weight gain. And we have this all the way down to preschoolers, where if you skip a nap, you start to see them consume extra calories. But school-age kids, have them go to bed later, just 1 hour later for 5 nights, and they start to increase their calorie intake by about 120 calories per day. Adolescents, you have them go to bed 2 hours later than their typical bedtime, and by the end of 2 weeks, they're gaining 2 to 3 pounds. And so we see very direct links between insufficient sleep and weight gain, which we know is, again, another public health concern with our youth. So there's a number of reasons that kids and teens don't sleep. So there's homework, and homework is something I can't control, but we do know that with increasing amounts of homework, we do see shorter amounts of sleep. But along with homework, we see a lot of stress and anxiety that's not necessarily homework related. Kids today are having more significant mental health issues than ever before, especially in our post-COVID world. We see that stress, anxiety, and depression are having a significant impact on our teens, our students, and sleep is definitely going to exacerbate these issues. And when they're having anxiety and stress and depression, they're not sleeping as well. Caffeine is readily available and highly touted as something to help you just get through it. These are the usual suspects: coffee, energy drinks, the sodas. Then we have technology, and we love to blame technology on everything. If kids just turned their phones off, right, then we wouldn't have this issue. The problem is, as I mentioned, the first studies of this, kids not getting enough sleep, are more than 20 years old. And we didn't have the technology that we have now. Back then it was like, get TVs out of the bedroom. But we know that technology can be a sleep stealer. We know kids use technology for homework, but social media in particular, and different types of social media, definitely steal sleep from kids. Extracurricular activities are really important. They're important for social development. They're important for athletics and intellectual development, for getting into college. However, these activities can take up a huge amount of time, and they often mean students are getting home late or waking up early. It can have an impact on sleep. But the one that I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking on is school start times. And the reason why is this is a public health policy, and one that affects every single student in your school. Whether or not they have homework, using caffeine, technology, or inactivities, early school start times have a significant impact on how much sleep a student will get. So the biology behind this has to do with our circadian rhythm, our internal clock. You all have one. We notice it most when we change onto or off of daylight saving time, which is a whole nother discussion. But our internal clock, we regulate it because our clocks run on a 24.2-hour day. And as we all know, there's only 24 hours in the day. So we use meals, routines, and schedules to keep our internal clock on schedule. But the strongest cues for our circadian rhythm are light and dark. And when darkness happens, darkness literally goes through the eyes to the back of the brain and says, hey, make melatonin. It's time to start thinking about sleep. So melatonin is released at a time a couple of hours before bedtime to help prepare our bodies for sleep, and then continue to be released overnight to help keep us asleep, because in the morning when we open our eyes to bright sunshine, that light goes through our eyes to the back of the brain and says, hey, stop making melatonin, it's time to wake up. So we need to have darkness at night, and we need to be able to see light in the morning in order to keep our internal clocks on schedule. Now, melatonin is a naturally produced hormone, and when adolescents go through puberty, hormones change, including melatonin. Back to those studies I was telling you about that determine how much sleep adolescents need, they also looked to see what time their melatonin was released and followed kids across puberty. And what we know is that the timing of the melatonin release in puberty gets delayed by about 1 to 2 hours, as represented by this red line. So even a kid who is the best of sleepers now has an internal clock that's delayed 1 to 2 hours, meaning they live a couple of time zones behind where they physiologically are. And what this looks like in reality is in the evening, when you and I are experiencing darkness and our body is saying, hey, let's get ready for sleeping, their bodies are at the peak of wakefulness. And then at 7 a.m. when we ask them to wake up, many cases get behind the wheel of a car, and if nothing else, be in their seats at school, learning at peak optimum, they're at the peak of physiological sleepiness. And this is why it's important for changing start times in middle schools and high schools as students are going through puberty. And this is why it is not impactful on elementary school students to move start times earlier, because they are not experiencing this circadian delay, and they are able to have earlier wake times. So stepping out, we like to think about things in a broader perspective. This is a model you may be familiar with because it's something that is talked about a lot in the schools, the whole school, whole community, and whole child. The child is at the center of this, but it takes a lot for a child to be successful. A lot of things within the schools, a lot of things around the schools, and then there's families and communities that all help for our students to be at their best. So I'm going to present my socio-ecological model using the Cherry Creek School District, which is my district here, as an example. This is the 4th largest school district in the state of Colorado, about 55,000 students, so larger than your district, but demographically similar in that it's 53% white and 20% Hispanic. 29% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. And what's notable about this school district is it's 108 square miles in suburban Denver. And why that's notable is when our high schools were starting at 7:10 a.m., the first students had to be picked up by the bus at 5:55 a.m. because there's a very long transportation time. And my understanding is your district is not wide but tall, has a very similar issue in terms of transportation time. So the proposed changes in 2017 were to move elementary schools back from 9 a.m. to 8 a.m., moved middle schools from about 8 a.m. to 8:50 a.m., and high schools were delayed from 7:10 a.m. to 8:20. There was a very lengthy process that went into this final decision, and I'm happy to spend time talking with you about that later, but today I'm going to really focus on the science. I do want to highlight something that was very critical, and I emphasize to every school district. When you make the start time change, if that's the group that you go towards, you also need to promote healthy sleep behaviors, because it's important to educate families why you're doing this. It's important to educate families on what healthy sleep looks like. And so we had an education campaign that went out at the start of the school year. The flyer you see on the left was published in both English and Spanish and all the languages we had. And the one on the right was a high school challenge to help students really understand when they change their sleep behaviors, how that impacts not only their sleep, but their daytime functioning. In terms of our study, we called it the Castle Study. We changed start times, longitudinal effects study. In the lower corner, you see my colleagues, Dr. Amy Fogg, who's a school psychologist, and Dr. Kyla Wallstrom. And this was a comprehensive 360-degree evaluation of outcomes, not just adolescent sleep. We conducted 3 annual surveys of students, and we had these surveys administered during the school day to reach as broad and as many students as possible. We had pre-change, 1 year post-change, and then 2 years, and that was the follow-up. Our student cohort, we had about 10% of parents say that we were allowed to link their data year over year. And we also collected community data from the Colorado Department of Transportation. We also did focus groups, we have nursing data, I have many other data points, but these are the 3 areas I'm going to talk with you about tonight. So starting at the individual level outcomes, of course, the reason we're most wanting to do this is for our students. This just shows you the demographics who participated in our study. The pink color that you see, those are elementary school students, K through 2, that parents reported on, that's the asterisk. 3rd through 5th graders were self-report in green, middle school here is 6th through 8th graders in blue, and then high school was 9th through 11th grade pre-change, and then 9th through 12th grade post-change and follow-up. And I mean, we had thousands on average of students and parents every year filling out these surveys, and our population was representative of our district. So on these graphs, you see those same 4 colors starting at the bottom. The pink is our youngest elementary kids, green is the older elementary, blue is middle, and purple is the high school. This is bedtimes, and I want to point this out because one of the myths that there is if we start school later, kids go to bed later. And what we found is that elementary school kids went to bed earlier because they were starting earlier. On average, our middle school students went to bed 8 minutes later, and our high school students went to bed on average 14 minutes later. So yes, later, but not quite to the drastic level that parents often expect will happen. However, in the mornings, what we saw was significant changes to wake times. The blue and the purple lines go up sharply because our middle school students were waking 45 minutes later, and our high school students were waking a full hour later. Our elementary school students were waking earlier because they had an earlier start time, about 20 minutes earlier. What this translates to with the bedtimes, the wake times, is how much sleep students were getting. On average, our middle school students got an extra 30 minutes of sleep per night, and our high school students got on average 45 minutes per night. Now again, this may not sound like a lot, but our middle school students were getting an extra 2.5 hours of sleep per school week. Multiply it across the weeks of the year. High school, again, 45 minutes a night is almost 4 extra hours of sleep per week. And by the end of the school year, you're talking 144 extra hours. It's really hard to make up sleep debt. This wasn't very hard. I mean, the change is hard, but immediately you see the difference and you see that this increase is changed and maintained at the follow-up period. What this also translated to is something we look at called weekend oversleep. If you sleep 2 or more extra hours on weekends or holidays than you do during a typical week, that's a sign of significant sleep deprivation. That's the big black bar you see at the top of this graph. And what you can see for the high school students is they were reporting getting that weekend oversleep. Immediately following the change to start times, they were no longer reporting that. We no longer had significantly sleep-deprived students. We did see a decrease in the middle school students as well. They were not quite at the same level, but still with significant benefit. Another way of thinking about this is the proportion of students who are getting sufficient sleep, which is defined by our government as 8 or more hours of sleep on average per school night. So Healthy People 2020 was proposed now 13 years ago, and their goal was to increase the percent of students by a whopping 2.2% over 10 years. What we found in our study with this Cherry Creek School District is that we more than doubled the number of students, or the percent of students who were getting sufficient sleep duration from 30% up to almost 63% post-change, and that was maintained at follow-up. For our middle school students, we define sufficient sleep as 9 hours, and again, you see a 50% increase, so we now have over 60% of students getting sufficient sleep duration maintained at follow-up. During this same time point, I want to highlight that the government data that we base these outcomes on, the percent of students getting sufficient sleep duration decreased by 5%. So this wasn't just some random change in the world, it was actually a direct result of healthy school start times. I also want to point out that the new target the government has set is 27% of students getting sufficient sleep duration, which is lower than the original baseline because, again, fewer students are actually getting enough sleep. When we looked at the data, we broke it down both by race and by socioeconomic status. These are just sample graphs. The top 3 graphs are bedtime, wake time, and sleep duration. The bottom 3 are for high school students. It's a rainbow of colors of our different races. We can see differences in terms of races of how much sleep they're getting in bedtimes and wake times, but the pattern is exactly the same. What we see, especially in the high school students, the bottom center graph, they all wake up later because school started later. They all get more sleep because school started later. The graphs for socioeconomic, meaning students who were and were not receiving free and reduced lunch, were identical to these graphs here. So the change benefited all students. I want to break this down just one more little bit further with the sleep, looking at the students whose data we were able to follow year to year, because this shows you that there is an impact both on biology with that change in puberty, as well as ecology, which is the school environment. So on this first graph here, we're looking at bedtime. It's a rainbow going from kindergarten at the bottom in red all the way up to 10th graders in black. And those grades are the grade that they started pre-change. So our kindergartners were in 2nd grade at the follow-up, and our 10th graders were seniors at the follow-up. And what you see on those lower solid bars is that those early elementary school kids, they stayed exactly the same in terms of bedtimes. Where you start to see bedtimes get later is when kids go to middle school. The dashed lines are when kids transition from one level to another, either from elementary to middle or middle to high. But the middle 3 bars is where you really start to see bedtimes get later biologically, which fits with what we know in terms of the changes with puberty. These are weekend bedtimes. Everybody goes to bed later, but I want to point out that the patterns between weekday and weekend bedtimes in terms of getting later are exactly the same in these graphs. That's important to note when you look at the weekday wake time graphs. I'm sorry, been a long day here. Weekday wake time on the left and weekend wake times on the right. The weekend wake time graph there looks a lot like the weekend bedtime graph, right? It's late and everybody delays as they get older. But the graph on your left showing the weekday wake times shows that kids wake up whenever school starts. Weekday wake times are clearly set by school start times, and this is why kids don't get enough sleep during the school week. Breaking that graph down even further, because I know it's really, really busy, but what I want to show you, these are where we changed the school start times, okay? It changed with the wake times, and this is for elementary and high schools that are starting at similar times or changed their times, and then this is for the middle schools. So this blue dashed line were kids who started in elementary school at 9 a.m., then went to middle school at 8:50 and stayed in middle school at 8:50. You can see their wake time didn't change at all. In this dark pink line, you see kids who started in middle school at 8 a.m. The next year they went to high school, started slightly later at 8:20 and maintained their wake time. This green line are elementary school kids who started in 4th grade, so they went from 9 to 8, so their wake time got earlier. But when they went back to that later middle school time, look, their wake time went later as well. And then this pink line is a student who started middle school at 8, then got to sleep in at middle school, and then had to wake up earlier, slightly earlier for high school. And again, you see these wake patterns directly related as kids are getting older and the school times changed. This is daytime functioning graphs. Again, very busy, I apologize, but looking K through 10, Red is pre-change, gray is post-change, blue is follow-up. The dashed lines are when they're in middle school, the dotted lines are when they're in high school, so again, you see kids crossing levels. Where you start to see changes in terms of negative outcomes, in terms of feeling nervous, anxious, worried, is middle school. That's when we start to see the bars jump up. That's probably not directly related to sleep or start times per se, but much more related to changes to middle school. The most notable changes we see with too tired to keep up with schoolwork is in the high school level. The bottom right graph, you can see especially 9th and 10th graders who started high school and then the following 2 years were no longer too tired to keep up with their schoolwork. So you definitely saw students reporting, I can now have enough energy to get my homework done, which we know is going to improve academic success, which after graduation we know is going to improve long-term success. Activities and employment is another area people are very concerned about, thinking, oh my gosh, if we do this, then kids are not going to be able to do their sports, they're not going to be able to work. A lot of families need their kids to work. So we've looked at both before and after school activities and then employment separately, green elementary, blue middle, purple high school, and gray employment. So before school activities in elementary school going from 9 to 8 clearly had a significant drop in the percent of students who were participating. Middle and high school did not change before school activities. Part of that was the superintendent made a moratorium on if you weren't already a before school sport or activity, you could not become one. So if you were swimming and hockey, great, you could stay before school, but football could not move their practices to the morning. Employment rates before school did not change. After school, we saw no change in participation at the elementary school level. As expected, because middle school got out latest, their participation dropped, and a smaller drop in participation in high school. This was most typically explained by kids who were doing activities both at school and in the community. So for example, if you were doing dance at school and dance in the community, often that school activity got dropped in preference for the community one. These percentages are not small when you consider how many students we're talking about, and you think about, in comparison, the number of students who are getting more sleep, which was all of them. It was a trade-off the superintendent was willing to live with. The employment numbers here, you do see this dip in the first year post-change, and then you see a follow-up, it's higher than baseline. We then took this graph here and we broke it out, comparing students who qualified for free and reduced lunch and those who didn't. For students who did qualify for free and reduced lunch, their employment percentage of students did not drop. In fact, it went up. So it did not impair the students who most needed to work after school. They still had that ability. They were still able to gain employment and work even with later start and end times. All right, stepping away from students, I'll go quickly because I know we have not much time, but I want to look at some of the family level outcomes and school level outcomes. We did look at parent sleep as well on this graph. Again, because parents have students at many levels, we had to break our parents up into a lot of different groups. And when you see in green are the positive changes, in pink are the negative changes. These were the only significant ones. So we did see that elementary school only parents, they went to bed earlier, they woke up earlier, but it didn't impact any other aspect of their sleep. Whereas middle school and high school parents, whether or not they had a student in elementary school, we found that they woke up later if you had a student in middle or high school. And when you're looking at high school only or only middle and high school, 23 to 25 minutes later per day, that's a lot. Increase in sleep duration, 20 minutes a day. The percent of parents reporting sufficient sleep duration went up quite a lot. Good quality sleep went up, and the percent of high school parents reporting that they were tired significantly decreased. So it not only benefited the students, but it benefited the parents who were also having to wake early to get their students up and going. Similarly, we looked at teachers' patterns. Same thing with the green, blue, and purple. Same patterns you see here with elementary school teachers going to bed earlier, middle and high school teachers about the same. Wake times, you see that exact same pattern with the later wake times for middle and high school, slightly earlier for middle school, slightly earlier for elementary school. And then we saw no change in sleep duration for elementary school teachers, but significant increase in sleep duration for middle and high school teachers. When we looked at the percent of teachers obtaining sufficient sleep duration at the middle school level, you can see up to 90% puts them on par. The high school teachers went up from 72 to 88% and put them on par with all other teachers. So this is huge. Again, I mentioned all the negative impacts of insufficient sleep has on students. It has those same impacts on adults. And so here you're giving teachers the best simple intervention, right? We can provide teachers with meditation classes or extra support or things that either cost a lot of money or take a lot of time out of a teacher's already very busy day. But a blanket public policy like healthy school start times is one way of benefiting all teachers at the same time. In addition to the sleep, feeling tired, we did see a slight increase in elementary school teachers who felt that in the first year, but back to baseline in the follow-up period. No real changes at middle school, but look at this change at the high school level of teachers feeling, half of them were feeling very tired, and post-change down to 29 to 28%. And then taking one step further out, looking at the community level outcomes in terms of drowsy driving, the students who reported drowsy driving, it dropped by 50% on the frequency. And with new students who are already not very good in reaction times and judgment, this is important. Your mornings are dark in the winter, and when the roads are cold and icy, your students are at increased risk for motor vehicle crashes. Drowsy driving just exacerbates that. In our district, we looked at where our school is in Arapahoe County, our two neighboring counties, Adams and Douglas. What you can see was a significant drop in crashes per 1,000 drivers in blue, which is Arapahoe County. Didn't change in Adams County, and it actually increased in Douglas County. Part of that had to do with a lot of construction that was being done near where these schools were. So you take students who were already drowsy, you put them in construction areas, and they saw an increase in accidents. So in sum, healthy school start times are important to ensure sleep and the sleep health of secondary school students. In general, moving earlier or moving elementary school students' start times earlier resulted in small changes in their sleep, no changes in their daytime functioning. But moving middle school and high school later had significant changes both on their sleep and daytime functioning. And there are downstream effects of healthy start times. So when you think about this, it's going to impact your entire community. And that's important to help assist with implementation, trying to find those pain points and mitigate them before they happen, as well as what do you want to evaluate when it comes to the outcomes so that you know this was a successful change. I have a lot of colleagues, some of the names are up here of all the people who helped with the research that I presented. Our research was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Evidence for Action Grant. So that's my email address. I know we're going to take questions now, but if there are any questions after, you can reach me there. So leave that there for a moment before I take it down and open the floor for questions.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. All right. Questions? We'll open to whoever has any. Yes, Superintendent Fung.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. That was really very informational and very helpful. So the question I have, being the superintendent here, is what have you seen, or has Jerry Creek seen, or nationwide impact on academic outcomes with a sleep change?
So in general, the reports are improved academic outcomes. It's a hard thing to measure. You can look at grades and test scores if you have the standardized of them. We tried to do it in our district. We have 6 high schools, and grades are done differently. When you try to look at SAT scores and compare them across years, there are other factors that go into it, like the test kept changing. The general report, though, from teachers is improvements. We saw slight improvements in grades when we pulled it out and looked at that. Other research from other districts have shown higher graduation rates, especially in low-income families and low-income students, because those students are often reliant on catching the bus in the morning, and if they oversleep and they miss the bus, they don't get to school. Whereas students from more affluent families are often able to catch a ride if they oversleep. So you have students who are coming to school, which means they're graduating from school. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not just about higher A's and higher B's, even potentially higher test scores. It's about students getting to school, being with their peers, being in a safe environment, getting meals, learning, and graduating, which we know you need to do to be on a path for success in life. We also know going to school is important for mental health, and getting enough sleep is important for mental health. So I think grades are important to consider, but I think it's part of the bigger package of why healthy school start times matter. It shouldn't be the sole outcome to consider.
Yeah, I think, a lot of times we focus on the test scores as far as, academic improvement. I think an equally important data point is failure rate. Have we seen a reduction in failure rate as a result of, shifting to the later start times?
Right. And again, I think it's something important to look at. I mean, we did, again, qualitative focus groups, and that was what we heard from students, was that their grades were better, they were failing less because they were asleep, they weren't missing as many classes, they were able to stay awake and alert, especially when you pull out and you look at first and second period classes in high school. That's where you really notice the changes, because those are the classes students are the most sleepy for, or the ones they're most likely to miss.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Dr. Petrie?
Thank you for that presentation. That was really interesting. I appreciate all the time and effort that went into that for you and your colleagues. I wanted to have you talk just a little bit more about what went into the change in terms of the busing situation. Here in Stillwater, we have kind of a complicated system. It's a bit of a Tetris sort of an arrangement, because we not only transport elementary school students in one tier and secondary students in another tier, but we also transport charter schools and parochial schools as well. And so making a change like this is a big thing. I noticed that in Cherry Creek you had your older students starting like, I think I want to say like 7:30 or something like that.
Grade change was 7:10 for high school.
7:10, but then after, nobody started before 8. How did you make that work?
So that was the busing logistical issues. And so Dr. Scott Siegfried was at the time, the deputy superintendent and became the superintendent who really worked on this. And again, when he started the planning process, brought to the table a task force. And the task force included board members, it included teachers, it included transportation, it included food and nutrition, sports, athletics, activities, principals, everyone at the table. And so there was a lot of discussion on how to make these 3 tiers work. Going to a single start time across the 3 levels, for each of the levels, was one of the things that they looked at. There's other districts in the area, Littleton Public Schools, that changed the year after we did. Busing is always the hardest thing to figure out, and it's a logistical issue. There's other organizations, I know of at least one, that work with districts on trying to plan it. So that's the hardest part, is figuring out how do we time the buses to get it so that we have this. They wanted to start elementary school a little earlier. They proposed 7:55. It turns out that starting a school at 7:55 is not okay, but 8 o'clock is, or something about on the hour. I don't know. It came out in a lot of focus groups that he did. So he was able to manage this, and they changed some of the routes, I think, for the high schools and the middle schools. Again, this was implemented in the fall of 2017, which was a terrible bus shortage year. I know every year since then has continued to be a terrible bus shortage year. And so there were a lot of middle school students who were getting late that year to school late that year. It had nothing to do with the start times. It was to do with the bus driver shortages. So I can't give you the answer on how magically to figure it out, but I know there are ways of figuring it out. There are people who do that specific logistics that I would recommend working with.
And do you remember how long it took for that task force to sort of figure out the logistics of this switch?
So their task force was an 18-month one from start to finish. So from the very first sit down, do we really even want to do this? So that wasn't, that part of it. I think the actual logistics of figuring out a bus schedule like Littleton, I think it can be done much faster if you have the data, if you have where people live, if you have, the routes. The logistics company can figure that out pretty quick.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Hunter?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. I was particularly struck by one of your last comments where you talked about kind of finding and mitigating early challenges to the kind of downstream effects of this decision. And you kind of hint at some of the benefits with the parents and teachers' outcomes with the sleep actually helping them, which is important. And one of the biggest things that we keep hearing is about childcare in our district. And were there other challenges that kind of came out in the downstream that you needed to figure out?
No, that was definitely one of them. And I have some links to presentations and some other data. So Dr. Siegfried did a number of community listening sessions. And so he met with parents, he met with students, he met with other community members. There was a survey that went out district-wide. It was the most responded to survey in the history of the district. And it wasn't a survey of, do you want to change? It was, if we change, and again, I can send you the survey questions, it's in one of our papers. If we change, what's your tolerance for change? How early are you willing to go for younger students? How late are you willing to go for older students? And some of the questions I was getting to are about childcare. And interestingly enough, a lot of parents report concerns about older siblings taking care of younger siblings. The kids didn't report that. The older siblings didn't report that as being an issue. What we found within our childcare system was that before school childcare became almost non-existent once you moved the start time from 9 to 8. So those kids who were being dropped off early because their parents had to get to work no longer had to go to school first. And the teachers reported significant benefits from this, because if you drop a kid off at 7:30 for before school care, by 9 a.m. they're done, they're not ready to learn. But you drop the same kid off at school at 7:30 for an 8 o'clock start time, they're ready to start learning at 8. So the before school care program became, like I said, almost non-existent. The after school care program doubled. And these were a lot of students who weren't typically or previously in after school care, but now that they were getting out at 2:45, needed someplace to go. So the after school program, this was one of the big problems that was solved, was they offered two-tiered timed childcare. So if you picked your student up at 4:30, it was one price. And if you picked them up at 6, it was the standard price that it had been the year before. So it allowed some families to pick their students up earlier, still get some after-school care in, and still remain affordable. Some of our districts some of our schools that were primarily Title I students, they would connect with Boys and Girls Club or the YMCAs in their area, and they created after-school activities that students could participate in with very low to no cost for families. So running clubs or drama clubs, or they would have activities for kids to do after school supervised, but didn't cost families money. And that would keep the kids busy enough until older siblings were able to get out of school at 3:30 and come and pick them up. So for those 45 minutes or whatever it was. And so that was, again, one of those problem-solving things that was done. On the other side of it was the middle school kids who were now starting at 8:50, and those parents were like, I have to go to work, and I don't trust that my kid's gonna get on the bus by themselves, because 12, 13, 14-year-olds, not really always that reliable in the morning. And so what the schools did was they opened up at 8 a.m. for a supervised breakfast study hall. So it only required a couple of staff people. The breakfast was open. Parents could drop their students off at 8 a.m., which was the previous school start time. And those students could have breakfast, could study, supervised environment without any cost to the family. And so that was something that came from direct feedback of families of how are we as middle school parents going to manage this? So it's listening and hearing what are the concerns of the community that will allow you to then mitigate those concerns.
Thank you, that was very informative. Yes.
Were there any expenses involved in making this change to the district? I mean, you just expressed the one about family, but for the district itself, any expenses, plus or minus?
This was a budget neutral proposal. And again, the superintendent's the one that would have to, it's probably in some of the presentations I can send you the links from, but it was created that way that there would not be additional expense in this district. I know the Littleton district did have some additional expense related to transportation, but it was within they were able to fit it in within their budgets or within what they had to make it work. So that was the additional expense they had. There were some smaller unexpected expenses, like Starting elementary schools earlier, food and nutrition ended up having to buy food warming carts for many of the schools because a lot of the kids didn't get there in time to eat breakfast. They were having to deliver breakfast to the classroom. So some things you can't anticipate everything, but I do recommend thinking really hard about food and nutrition when you're starting to do your planning, because that's an area that's often really rarely discussed and has a big impact on students as well.
We'll go with Andrew then.
Yes, well, thank you again. A lot of the questions I'm kind of going through that I had beforehand have been thoroughly addressed, so really appreciate the comprehensive nature of your presentation, so thank you. I think the challenge that we always have is that, we live in a more complex world where there's always multiple outcomes. And, as we look at those some outcomes, when action's taken, the intended outcome usually, might occur, but there's always some unintended, outcomes or consequences that result. It seems like your research and the research of others really highlights many of the positive benefits. And can you speak upon any of the challenges that you have seen or some of those unintended consequences that we have to be mindful of and hopefully having the hindsight?
Yeah, the elementary school teachers, through our focus groups and through our surveys, one of their concerns was by starting earlier, they lost their before school planning time. It was a challenge for them. That was the time when teams would meet, when teachers would meet with parents. They used that hour or that time before 9 a.m. start time for a lot of those types of things, and they were very frustrated with that. And so the district heard that, and the change that they made, again, a couple years out, was to have an early dismissal day, which the district had never had before. So Wednesdays are now early dismissal for elementary schools. And that 1 hour earlier dismissal allows teachers, that's their time for in-service learning, it's for team planning, it's for parent meeting, it's for those types of things. And so that's one of those unintended consequences that, again, had to be problem solved and mitigated. I will tell you, the worry about consequences and unintended consequences is much greater than the actual unintended consequences that may happen. Change is really, really hard. No one likes to change. Families don't like to change. Teachers don't like to change. Students, nobody likes to change, right? We like being in our nice, normal routine. Most of the problems you will face are grown-up problems. They are solvable problems if you put some time and effort into it. People will be very fearful of this up until the point where it's no longer a memory. Again, we implemented in 2017, we finished our research in the spring of 2019, and then COVID hit. And seriously, there's no one in the district who remembers what life was like before this. California is an entire state that has done this, so it shows you that if an entire state can do this, you can do it. The problems can be solved. The changes and the consequences will feel dire that first year, will feel maybe a little bit painful the second year, and by the third year, if you stick with it, which I really have to stick with it, you won't remember. Everybody will adjust. Work will adjust. Those after-school activities will adjust. People adjust to change when it is forced upon them. But spending time with your community, doing listening sessions with your members, with the students, with the parents, with the teachers and staff, doing it in multiple languages, make sure that all members of your community are heard from. I cannot emphasize the importance of doing that before the implementation, just to make sure that you are trying to mitigate as much as you can, but also so that your community knows that if you miss something, you'll fix it, right? And these things are not that hard to fix. They're not expensive. The benefits just so far exceed and outweigh. At this point, there's no research showing negative outcomes of healthy school start times.
Dr. Kelsenberg?
Sure. You probably beforehand surveyed your community. What about afterwards? Did you survey and then they're saying, hey, good move, bad move?
So in our surveys that we did, in these post-surveys with the parents, we had the questions. So the pre-survey, we said, what do you think of this? Is this going to be, and we asked this of the students and teachers as well, is this going to be good for you? Is this going to be good for other students of the district? And then in the following year, we did ask questions related to, so has it been good for you? Do you disagree with it? For the most part, overwhelmingly, people were very positive about it. The students in particular were incredibly positive about it. The families were mostly positive about it. In our focus groups, the qualitative work, The negatives that came out from the parents was that by getting out later, the evenings were a little bit more rushed and activities ended later. Some of the elementary school parents reported, as their child got older, and I was living this at the time, my child was in elementary school, and I'll tell you, as a 5th grader, he was a lot harder to wake up than he was in those earlier years. So they talked about mornings being more rushed and the increased use of after-school care. Some of the teacher challenges felt like fewer students were seeking help. I don't know that that's continued. They did complain a lot about worse afternoon traffic, that their evening personal routines were a little bit later, that students were leaving earlier for athletics because districts around us hadn't changed yet, and that there was some decline in afternoon student engagement in the middle school level. So, I think sometimes there are things that people are less happy about afterwards, but for the overwhelming sense of the benefits, the focus groups, parents talking about how their kids are no longer zombies, how they can have conversations with them, they eat breakfast, the students talking about being able to go to school when the sun's up, makes such a huge difference, right? Because when you go to school and it's dark out, and by the time you're done, it's dark out, you never see the light of day. That's really hard. And so that was one of the top things that students talked about, and having more energy and just being more alert and engaged and happier. So some of those intangibles that you can't necessarily get with the surveys.
Dr. Lower?
Thank you so much for this. It's kind of, it's reassuring. It's kind of like school time change in a box. It sounds like there are ways to deal with everything.
Yes.
Going back to just the science of sleep, I feel like I read something about, particularly for the high schoolers, that they not only, if you're getting more time, 45 minutes a night, it's not just that it's more sleep, but better sleep. Just the cycle, the sleep cycle.
Yes.
Can you
Yeah, I
speak
used
to
to have
that
a
a little
slide in
bit?
my presentation, but I run out of time, so I have to take things out. So over the course of the night, when you go through your different stages of sleep, the first part of the night is when you get your deepest sleep, and that's when brains are forming, and so that's really important for kids. But the last third of the night is when we get our REM, or our dreaming sleep. And that's when memories form, and that's when learning sticks. So I'm always telling my students and patients, look, study and sleep on it, as opposed to staying up all night. Because if you sleep on it, it will consolidate. When you lock those last 2 hours of the night off, when you're supposed to be getting the REM sleep, that definitely impacts students' ability to learn and remember and retain information. So it has a direct impact on that academic part that we were talking about. So it does improve their sleep quality in that they're getting that full night of sleep, they're getting all the stages of sleep that they need for growth and development and for that academic health.
Yes, Dr. Peter?
You had mentioned earlier that when you went to the later start time, that the superintendent said that athletic teams could not practice,
Yes.
because that sort of,
Defeats
takes
it.
away the whole purpose of doing it. And you also mentioned that other school districts around you did not necessarily have the same schedule. How did things settle out then with athletics? I would imagine that they weren't very happy about this change as a group. And how did that all settle out eventually?
So at the time, and still currently, the athletic director was brothers with the then superintendent, not Dr. Siegfried, but Dr. Bull. He was on board from the first day. Again, he was at the table from the first day. And the understanding about the benefits to the health and well-being of students outweighed this concern. In terms of, they continued to have shorter practices after school. So practices were shorter, but students were more alert and awake, so they were actually more productive. So you could have a 3-hour practice with dragging, tired, sleepy kids, or you could have a 2-hour practice with kids who are alert and energetic. And you find those shorter practices with kids who have slept well, they do better. I have just, the qualitative data of how our sports teams did in those 2 years after the change, and it's hard to say because we are a pretty good district to begin with, but we did have an increase in our number of sports teams that were doing well, so there weren't any negative consequences there. We do know that some sports teams were illegally practicing in the morning, but it was really an effort to try and keep that benefit of later start times sort of, really important, and keep it safe. and keep it equal. And so there was no zero period offered. There were no activities offered because those involve transportation. The school doesn't provide transportation for 0 hour or before school activities, so parents have to bring you. And again, it's an equity issue. That's a problem because not all kids have families who can bring them to school early for activities, for 0 hour, for those types of things. So that was part of the decision as well, is this is a decision we're making to benefit all of our students, and so we need to keep keep it equal across the board for all of our students. I didn't sleep well last night, so that's why I apologize.
Thank you.
Dr. Thielander?
Yeah, you kind of, in some of the data points, you talk about the follow-up, and you also mentioned, giving it 3 years to really see the full effects. What was the follow-up time frame in your data points?
Yep, so our pre-change survey was done in the spring of 2017, and the New Start times were implemented in the fall of 2017. So our follow-up time points were the spring of 2018 and the spring of 2019. So it was at the end of the second full school year when we collected that second follow-up time point. We were unable to do any additional data collection after that because the additional third year out was COVID. So, yeah.
And you kind of mentioned, obviously, change is hard. I mean, and no matter who it is, adults or, children tend to be more resilient sometimes than adults.
Yes.
And I think of what things as a school board can we control. I know school boards can do a lot of things to mess things up really quickly, but there's a few things that I think we can really do to make things a lot better. Unfortunately, some of those things, there's a high price tag that just isn't economically feasible.
Right.
But it seems like this is something that can really move the needle. And as you, so if that's something that's really makes a difference, what was the lead time that you had provided within your experience to help change the hearts and minds of the community, I guess?
Yeah, so the decision was made in March of 2017 for that upcoming school year. A similar decision was made most recently, just the past year, Denver Public Schools, which is our largest district here. You need to give families notice in the spring, I would say February, March, April, as soon as you can, to let them start planning over the summer what life is going to be like come fall. Districts that have announced in August that they're implementing the new change right then and there have failed. And in fact, several of those districts have just gone back on it and said, never mind, we change it back. So giving those lead time of the final decision. Now that final decision came after, again, all the surveys and all of that were launched in the fall of 2016. So I got involved with this. I can tell you it was the day after Election Day when I met Dr. Siegfried for the first time, because he's saying, I'm going to put this survey out and every parent is going to say, this is a great idea. And me being the jaded person I am, knowing about the history of changing school start times, was like, yeah, right. Don't we know, these surveys and elections and numbers don't always mean what we think they're going to mean. And so that was in November of 2016. The first survey went out in December, and then the feedback sessions continued after that. He had already been doing them for several months. So, and then the data were first presented to the board in February, and the board voted in March. That was our timeline.
Yes.
I want to follow up on that for a second. You sort of alluded to this because I had a question about, because I know that you follow this sort of thing all over the country, and I'm just wondering if there are districts that implemented the change and then decided to go back and reverse it, like maybe a year later. It sounds like some of them who didn't give enough planning to it, they ended up reversing it. So I guess that would be my first question. Are there any districts that you know of that did it for a year and then just decided it wasn't working? And then my second question would be, what other things besides giving families that good lead time, are there any other pieces of advice that you have in terms of how to make this change as successful as possible?
So it's been a while since a school district has changed and gone back. That used to be a more frequent thing. A lot of times they would change for the right reason, and then there would be leadership changes, and they would say, because of money or because of this, we have to switch it back. And so it wasn't about keeping the students' best interest in mind. It was for these other reasons they would change back. Families don't like to change, so if you're gonna change, you have to stick with it. And if you're gonna make a change, it has to be a notable change. So don't change 5 minutes this year, 5 minutes next year, and 5 minutes the following year. That just annoys families, right? Like, if you're gonna make a change, pick it and stick with it. And that was something the Arlington School District learned, where they tried to implement a 15-minute change, and then the next year they said, but we're gonna do it another 15 minutes later. And families became very frustrated. They still went ahead with it, and now that's years ago, and they're fine, but if you want less pushback, that's something that we talk about, is just not doing that micro changes. Boston was the most notable. Boston just announced out of the blue, we're changing it, and there was such a backlash that they changed it back, and to my knowledge, they've never changed it back to the healthy start times again. I think we've seen more districts across the country, and I mean, all sorts of districts. So suburban, like yours in our district, urban, like Seattle, again, the entire state of California, a school and a half year ago, implemented this across the state. Middle schools can start, it's law. Middle schools can start no earlier than 8, and high schools can start no earlier than 8:30. And so up and down the state, they've had to figure out ways of getting students there and making this work. So I'm not really sure I'm answering your question. I know you're all asking how to really avoid all the issues. I think education of families is important. Again, the education about the importance of sleep, about why you're doing this, helping families problem solve, really listening and getting input and providing solutions, and keeping families notified about what's going on. Jefferson County, which is also here in suburban Denver, they've had a group, you can find their webpage, and it took them many years to finally implement the change. But they had a website where they kept families and everybody informed. We did this survey, we have this information, this is what we're looking at. So people knew, so it wasn't secret, it didn't feel like it was veiled or hidden, or we're gonna just spring this on you. We recognize this is a significant change, and one we're doing for the benefit and well-being of our students, but here are some things that we hear from you and that we're working on making changes toward.
Thank you.
We're fortunate enough to have a student representative on our school board, so I don't know if you see him, but Sam, not to put you on the spot, but has anything come up with the student body, or any questions that you have? Or?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern with students is the extracurriculars, and I know you did touch on that, especially with employment rising, which I thought was surprising. But I guess that is my biggest concern, is with extracurriculars and how that works with exiting school later.
Yeah, it does get out later, and students talk about that. It'll be important for athletics if they have lights, like especially there. I know your sun sets even earlier than our sun sets here, and so are there lights on the fields? Are there ways of making sure that some activities are allowed to continue? Again, I do feel like students thought that their participation was okay, that they were able to get enough done. The complaint we heard is then we have to go home and do so much homework. So homework load's a whole other issue that is not related to this, but sometimes feels like it factors into it, because then we have to still go home and do homework. So we did hear that concern with students. The other one was the athletes leaving early. Again, in our district, one of the things, we had 6 high schools. So what they did was during the week, because no districts around us had changed yet, during the week they tried to keep school competitions within the district, and then on the weekends to compete against districts who got out at different times. Now, because all the districts around us are getting out later as well, it's not such an issue of pulling students out. But that was something that was noted both by students and by teachers in terms of student athletes having to leave earlier. Again, the percent of students who are student athletes that this will impact versus the percent 100 of students who have the opportunity to get more sleep, it becomes a trade-off.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yeah?
Yeah, so, I think you kind of mentioned in a vacuum, it's a great way of just staying focused on what's best for, student learning and obviously student health benefits, and the research is highly compelling. But, as I kind of try to quantify what we can measure, and you kind of mentioned, some of the academic outcomes can sometimes be hard to do so. But, I think from the research, it's safe to assume that, the sleep benefits can be categorized as significant. which parlays into some of the other social, emotional, and other mental health aspects of student learning, which, in turn, it's kind of the, it's kind of the chicken and the egg. Would that then also help provide the benefits to the student outcomes? Is that a safe way of trying to think through this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the sleep is the most obvious one to measure, but you also can ask students about their ability of staying awake during class, because not only is that sleep related, but that's their ability to learn during class time. That question that I showed you in terms of getting homework done or feeling too tired to get their homework done, that can show academics. The mental health piece is huge. I didn't put all those slides up, but that feeling of nervousness, anxious, and worried, those all decreased in that first year post-change. And what was really noticeable about that was that post-change survey happened a week after the Parkland shooting. And so our students were tense and they were already a bit agitated, but yet they were still reporting they felt less worried, anxious, and nervous than they did before the start time change. In our focus groups, that was the thing that, again, besides seeing the light, students reported the most on is that they felt happier. There's other students seemed less angry, people were getting along. That mood piece was so important. Littleton, again, our neighboring district, they have like a 98, 99% graduation, go on to college rate type of thing, but they had a number of student suicides in recent years, and to them, it felt like this was going to be a way of helping students get more sleep and to start addressing some of the mental health concerns. It's not the solution, right? Our students are under stress for a lot of reasons, but if they're not getting enough sleep, that mental health crisis is never going to get better, right? So it gives students at least one step forward in trying to address the mental health issues that they're experiencing these days. Same thing with teachers and with teacher burnout. All of that's going to be worse if they're not sleeping. So some of these things are harder to measure. Qualitative work is really important for doing some of this, getting to those focus groups, talking to people, hearing what they're saying in the outcomes can be really useful. And again, I can send you some of our qualitative findings. Those are things that are kind of hard to quantify, but really show the benefits of these healthier start times.
Did you track anything on I'm just trying to again think of ways we can measure, but physical health or nurse, going to the nurse, or was any of that tracked?
We did. We tracked nurse visits and why they were going to the nurse and what time they were going to the nurse. And, as expected, we saw at elementary schools some more morning visits, higher morning visits that you would expect. And some of those were kids who were hungry and kids who were tired, type of thing. We saw a decrease in those types of visits at the middle and high school level. You don't get quite as many nurse visits to begin with, but definitely took a look at that to see was this making an impact in terms of the nursing visits. We have our youth risk behavior survey, our anonymous data that we tried looking at sort of the year-to-year stuff in terms of more serious mental health questions, in terms of things like alcohol and vaping and unsafe behaviors. But unfortunately, these surveys were done at a time where you could see across the nation that all of these things were getting worse. Ours flatlined, which we saw as a positive thing, whereas compared to national data, things in the nation were getting worse, we stayed flatlined. We didn't necessarily improve, but we didn't get worse. So these are things that are kind of hard to assess and say for sure is it a result of the start time, but it sure felt like it. So yeah.
And then one last question for me is, you don't want to cause harm to any student through a change. Do you feel pretty confident in the elementary students when they're starting earlier that, it seems that the scientific evidence would suggest this is not harmful to younger students. But do you have any thought, were people nervous about that initially with this change?
Yeah. Our elementary school parents were the loudest, most vocal critics. They started a petition, they went to the news media, they were the ones that were up in arms. And it was our most affluent families, elementary school families, that were the loudest vocal critics of this. They were fine. The kids were fine. An education piece has to go along with it. Our students went to bed 10 minutes earlier, but woke up 20 minutes earlier. So on average, when you work that out, they were getting 10 minutes less sleep per night. Now, if the students had gone to bed earlier, which they physiologically can do because they haven't gone through puberty yet, like the teachers did, if they went to bed 20 minutes earlier and woke up 20 minutes earlier, their sleep would not have changed. And so I think that that education piece was really important. I think that the daytime functioning, we didn't see any changes in the elementary school student. Nothing in terms of their mood, in terms of their behavior, nothing parent reported or self-reported. So their daytime functioning, the teacher report was all good. So with that 10 minutes of sleep loss, you can narrow in and focus on that. But, excuse me, in terms of their overall functioning and well-being, they were fine. And the elementary school parents were very happy. They felt like kids had more time after school to just be kids and to just play. And again, for a lot of these kids who would spend an hour and a half or 2 hours at normal school care, now they're able just to go to school and learn in the morning and be more alert and awake in the morning. So there was a lot of outcry, even at the board meeting. One of my colleagues who's a sleep physician and whose daughter is the same age as my son at the time got up and talked about all the unintended consequences we were going to have on our elementary school children and how terrible this was going to be. And none of it manifested. You know, there are kids who are already hard to wake up in the morning in elementary school, but just imagine how hard they're going to be able to wake up in middle school and high school. So can I tell you that for 100% of students this is fine? No, but for most students this is fine. They're going to be fine, and for the ones who are not fine, they're already struggling with other types of issues.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm not sure if Colorado has the same open enrollment policies as Minnesota, but did you have any changes in your open enrollments in or out?
No, no changes. So the enrollment stayed steady. It was still, nothing changed.
Right.
Great, well, thank you so much. Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much. And thank you for your email. So we can continue these conversations if anything else comes up. But thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your expertise in this area. It's extremely helpful. I know we've been talking about this as a district for a long time now. And so it's just, you know, seeing the benefits and doing the communication and just really doing a thoughtful analysis. And this has been very helpful in that process. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that you're all thinking about it. And again, any additional resources, just shoot me an email and I'm happy to pass this along to you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.